So imagine standing right there before the undisputed rulers of a nation.
Yeah, the men who basically hold all the power.
Exactly. And this is just days after they have won a incredibly bloody, just exhausting civil war.
Right. I mean, the men sitting in those pews in front of you have spent years funding armies,
Burying their friends.
living under this constant, suffocating anxiety of total ruin, you know.
Yeah, but now the enemy generals have surrendered. The king has literally fled in disguise.
The war is effectively over.
Right, so the men in this room, they are expecting a victory lap.
Oh, absolutely. They want you, the preacher of the hour, to validate their military genius.
To assure them that God is on their side, right? And to offer this comfortable benediction over their newfound power.
But instead, you step into the pulpit, you look them dead in the eye, and you tell them that their military triumph is essentially meaningless.
Wow.
Yeah. And that unless they immediately deploy all their resources to combat this massive, invisible spiritual crisis, their souls and the soul of the nation are in imminent danger.
It's honestly one of the most audacious pivots in the history of public address.
It really is. You're looking at a moment where political theology and divine providence just, well, they collide in spectacular fashion.
And the speaker doesn't offer a single word of political flattery. He just bypasses all the bloodshed and the statecraft to confront them with this terrifying reality that the true battle hasn't even begun.
Exactly.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the place where we take a deep dive into the historical texts, the theology, and the profound ideas that have really shaped the Christian worldview. I am so glad you're joining us today.
It's going to be a good one.
Yeah, we are looking at a monumental piece of source material today. It's a sermon delivered in the 17th century by the legendary Puritan theologian John Owen.
Right, and the title he gave it is A Vision of Unchangeable Free Mercy.
Which is such a powerful title, and our mission in this deep dive is to explore Owen's incredibly rigorous theology regarding God's absolute sovereignty, specifically in the distribution of grace.
The totally unmerited nature of the gospel.
Right, and his devastating assessment of what it actually means to live a life without Christ.
But to really grasp the sheer weight of what Owen is doing here, we can't just look at the theology in a vacuum.
No, we have to understand the room he was speaking to.
We do, because the context is what makes the theology so explosive.
So set the stage for us.
Okay, we need to set the historical stage very precisely here. The date is Wednesday, April 29th, 1646.
Okay.
And the location is St. Margaret's Church in Westminster, which was the parish church of the House of Commons.
Right.
Now, for 4 years, England had been tearing itself apart in the First English Civil War.
And you had the royalists, right, who supported King Charles I and his belief in the divine right of kings?
Yes, fighting against the parliamentarians who believed the king had overstepped his bounds both legally and religiously.
And the cost of this conflict just cannot be overstated.
No, not at all.
I mean, we are talking about a war that proportionally resulted in a massive loss of life across the British Isles.
The men sitting in St. Margaret's that Wednesday had governed through a period of unparalleled national trauma.
Right, but that trauma was suddenly giving way to this stunned, almost overwhelming sense of victory.
Exactly. Just the previous month, the royalist cause had completely collapsed.
Wow.
Yeah, Hopton and Astley, they were the last two royalist generals who had managed to keep an army in the field. And they were decisively defeated and forced to surrender.
There is a famous historical anecdote from Astley's surrender, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. He sat down on a drum, looked at his parliamentarian captors, and he said, "You have now done your work and may go to play unless you will fall out among yourselves."
Which, I mean, turned out to be an incredibly prophetic statement considering what happened in the years that followed.
Yeah, highly prophetic.
But in that specific moment, April 1646, the feeling in London must have been just electric.
Unparalleled. I mean, the work of the war was so thoroughly finished that Oliver Cromwell, the brilliant cavalry commander of the New Model Army, he had safely returned to his seat in Parliament just a week earlier.
On April 22nd, right?
And then the ultimate validation of their victory happened just 2 days before the sermon.
Oh, Monday, April 27th.
Yes. King Charles I, realizing his cause was entirely lost, he fled his stronghold in Oxford disguised as a servant.
It's just wild to think about. So the head of the enemy state has literally abandoned his throne and is running for his life.
Exactly.
The parliamentarians are suddenly the undisputed masters of England, and they call this man, John Owen, to deliver a sermon of thanksgiving.
Right.
But who exactly is Owen at this point in his life? Because he isn't yet the towering academic figure we usually think of when we hear his name, right?
That is a crucial detail to keep in mind. Today, theologians know John Owen as the Prince of the Puritans.
Right, the guy who wrote all those dense volumes.
Yeah, he would eventually become the vice chancellor of Oxford University, arguably the most formidable theological mind of his era.
Sure.
But in April 1646, he was barely 30 years old.
Wow. Barely 30.
He was the pastor of a relatively quiet, obscure parish in Coggeshall in Essex.
So he's essentially a nobody.
Pretty much. He had written a couple of theological treatises that caught the attention of some influential people, but he was definitely not a political insider.
So he was an outsider brought right into the absolute epicenter of British power on a day of national Thanksgiving.
Exactly. Which makes his choice of text so fascinating.
I mean, human nature dictates that if you are a young pastor, given the biggest platform of your life in front of the politicians who just won a civil war.
You preach from the Psalms.
Yes. You talk about David defeating Goliath or the Israelites crossing the Red Sea.
You give them a narrative that maps perfectly onto their military victory.
Right. But instead, Owen turns to the New Testament. He goes to the book of Acts, chapter 16, verse 9.
And the text says, "And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, 'Come over into Macedonia and help us.'"
So he takes this ancient, desperate cry for help from a Roman province, and he just lays it directly onto the consciences of the English Parliament.
He essentially tells them, "Congratulations on your military victory. But while you're celebrating, there are people in this country crying out for a rescue that your armies cannot provide."
That is just brilliant. Let's look closely at how Owen unpacks this biblical text, because he doesn't just read the verse and move to an emotional appeal.
No, not at all.
He starts with this highly technical, meticulous breakdown of the mechanics of divine communication.
He explores exactly how God was speaking to the Apostle Paul in this moment.
Right, because Owen was a master of classical Reformed scholasticism.
He believed that precision in theology was essential for clarity and application.
So he begins by offering his audience a comprehensive taxonomy of divine visions.
He categorizes how God communicates by strictly dividing the experiences.
Okay, let's break that down.
Well, first, he looks at the physiological state of the prophet or the apostle receiving the revelation. Is the person waking or are they sleeping?
Because God historically used both, right? I mean, we see dreams throughout the Old Testament.
We do. Joseph, Daniel, Jacob dreams were a deeply recognized medium.
Right.
But Owen immediately moves to a second category, which is the nature of what is actually being revealed.
He divides this into internal and external revelations, doesn't he?
He does. Sometimes God communicates purely by word, giving an internal discovery of hidden truth to the mind without any outward visual component.
Just a prompting or a spoken word to the Spirit.
Exactly. But other times, the revelation is accompanied by sensible, visible apparitions.
Things the prophet can actually see with their physical eyes.
Precisely. And Owen divides those visible apparitions even further into the appearances of things versus the appearances of persons.
Okay, give us some examples of things.
Well, for the appearances of things, he points to Jeremiah seeing a boiling pot,
Oh, right.
or Amos seeing a plumb line, or Ezekiel's famous super complex vision of the wheels within wheels.
So these are symbolic objects meant to convey a very specific message.
Right. But for the appearances of persons, Owen notes that Scripture records manifestations of the second person of the Trinity appearing in pre-incarnate glory.
Or angels appearing as messengers.
Yes, or, as in Paul's case here in Acts 16, the appearance of a man of Macedonia.
Now, I have to ask about the why here.
Okay.
Why does Owen spend the opening minutes of this incredibly critical address to Parliament dissecting the taxonomy of visions?
It's a fair question.
Because to a modern listener, this might feel like an academic tangent. Why does it matter to the English government in 1646 whether Paul saw a thing or a person or whether he was asleep or awake?
It matters deeply because of the specific cultural and political anxieties of the mid-17th century.
How so?
We have to remember that the parliamentarian side, specifically the New Model Army, was incredibly religiously diverse.
Okay.
And it was a massive breeding ground for radical sects. You had groups like the Quakers, the Diggers, the Levelers, the Fifth Monarchists.
Right, lots of fringe groups popping up.
And many of these radical sectarians were beginning to claim direct new revelations from God.
Oh, I see.
They were claiming to have dreams and ecstatic visions, telling them to overthrow social hierarchies, abolish private property, or inaugurate the millennial kingdom by force.
Ah, so the idea of divine visions wasn't just a theological concept for these politicians, it was a live political threat.
Exactly. Parliament was terrified of sectarian chaos.
If people believe God is speaking to them in their sleep, telling them to cause anarchy, Parliament has a massive crisis on its hands.
Right. So Owen, as a leading Reformed theologian, steps into the pulpit and immediately establishes theological order.
That's brilliant. By meticulously categorizing biblical visions, he is signaling that true divine revelation is not chaotic.
It is not arbitrary,
Yeah.
and it is firmly tethered to biblical precedent.
And this is why Owen spends significant time arguing that the Apostle Paul was absolutely, definitively awake when he saw the Macedonian man.
Yes. How does he prove that, though? Because the text says the vision appeared in the night.
The natural assumption is that Paul was asleep in bed.
Well, Owen dives into the original Greek to make his case.
He focuses on two specific words used in the New Testament for visions, right?
Yes, optasia and harama.
And in Owen's day, some scholars tried to neatly divide these terms.
Right, they argued that optasia always meant a waking vision, and harama always meant a sleeping vision, or a dream.
But Owen, with his immense linguistic capability, systematically dismantles that assumption.
He does. He points out that the linguistic division just doesn't hold up in other parts of Scripture.
Give us an example.
He reminds his audience that in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain, he commands Peter, James, and John to tell the vision to no one.
Okay.
And the Greek word Jesus uses right there is harama.
Ah, and the disciples were demonstrably awake on the Mount of Transfiguration.
Exactly. They saw the physical glory of Christ, Moses, and Elijah. Therefore, Owen concludes, a harama is not inherently a dream.
That makes perfect sense. Furthermore, he argues that the mention of the night in Acts 16 is not intended to imply that Paul was sleeping.
Right. Rather, it is meant to highlight Paul's intense, watchful dedication.
He's painting a picture of pastoral anxiety.
Yes. Paul isn't asleep. He is awake in the middle of the night, wrestling in prayer, desperately trying to figure out where God wants him to take the gospel next.
He is actively seeking the counsel of God when this Macedonian man appears.
And when the man speaks, his phrasing is remarkably specific.
He doesn't just say, "Come to Macedonia."
No, he says, come over into Macedonia and help us.
Now, this concept of help is really the hinge of Owen's entire argument.
It is.
And to fully appreciate it, we need to understand the geopolitical reality of Macedonia at that time.
Right. Macedonia was not some backwater. This was the homeland of Alexander the Great.
It was a region with a rich history of military conquest and philosophical heritage.
But by the time of the Apostle Paul, Macedonia had been subjugated.
It was a province under the iron boot of the Roman Empire.
Right. It was a conquered territory.
Mhm.
They had lost their autonomy, their empire, their political freedom.
So if a man from a subjugated Roman province appears in a vision, crying out for help, a logical mind might assume he is asking for liberation.
He is asking for a military alliance to throw off the yoke of the Caesars.
But if Macedonia wanted political freedom, they would never have called the Apostle Paul.
No. Paul was a Jewish tent maker with a criminal record in multiple cities.
He had no army, no political influence, no wealth.
If the Macedonians wanted to fight Rome, they would have sent an envoy to the Parthians.
The Parthian Empire was the only superpower in the East capable of checking Roman expansion.
Exactly. They had the heavy cavalry and the resources to actually challenge the legions.
Right. So the fact that the vision directs this plea to Paul proves that the help required was not political.
Or military or financial.
It's an issue of having the right person for the specific crisis.
I mean, if an aristocrat is suffering from a massive arterial blockage and his heart is failing, he doesn't call a master architect to remodel his house.
No, he doesn't call a military general to guard his door. He needs a surgeon.
Exactly. The Macedonians were experiencing a crisis that Rome hadn't caused and that Parthia couldn't cure.
Paul fought spiritual battles. He fought the principalities and powers of darkness. Therefore, this Macedonian cry was a spiritual emergency.
And Owen frames this with a very specific, evocative phrase. He calls it a soul want.
A soul want.
The Macedonians were in a state of spiritual starvation. The help they needed was deliverance from the wrath of God, from eternal death, and from the dominion of Satan.
They needed the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And this brings Owen to a massive theological pivot in the sermon.
Right, because to understand why Paul was sent to Macedonia to provide this help, you have to look at what happened immediately before the vision.
This is where the text of Acts 16 becomes deeply challenging.
Because verses 6 and 7 detail Paul's itinerary just prior to arriving in Troas, where he actually has the vision.
And the text explicitly states that Paul and his companions had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia and were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia.
Forbidden.
And then when they came to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit suffered them not.
So God actively, intentionally blocked the Apostle Paul from taking the gospel to certain regions.
He did,
Yeah.
which completely disrupts our modern democratic assumptions about fairness and the dissemination of information.
Right. We naturally assume that if a cure for a deadly disease is found, it should be distributed equally and immediately to every corner of the globe.
But here, the Holy Spirit acts as a divine blockade.
He routes Paul away from Asia, away from Bithynia, and specifically directs him to Macedonia.
If the gospel is the sole means of salvation, if it is the only way a soul can be rescued from eternal death, it forces a devastating question.
Why does God send the mechanism of salvation to one place and actively, purposefully withhold it from another?
And this question forms the foundation of Owen's first major theological observation for the House of Commons.
He tells the assembled leaders of England the dispensation of the gospel, where it goes, when it goes there, and who hears it, is entirely and exclusively regulated by the eternal, determinate purpose and counsel of God.
Yes, let's unpack the mechanics of that observation, because Owen is drawing a line in the sand against several competing worldviews here.
He definitely is. First, he explicitly rejects the idea that the spread of the gospel is a matter of chance.
He uses a very specific philosophical phrase. He rejects the idea that history is governed by a casual concurrence of atoms.
A casual concurrence of atoms, that is a direct shot at Epicurean philosophy, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Epicureanism was an ancient Greek philosophy that was really beginning to experience a revival in the 17th century.
Especially among early secular thinkers and materialists.
Exactly. The Epicurean view was that the universe is just a random collision of atoms in a void.
There is no overarching design.
No divine architect. And the gods, if they exist at all, are entirely disinterested in human affairs.
So history is just a series of random accidents.
Yes. So if an Epicurean looked at Paul going to Macedonia instead of Asia, they would say, oh, maybe a bridge was washed out in Asia.
Or maybe Paul just flipped a coin and it came up Macedonia. It's all just geographic luck.
Precisely. And Owen vehemently denies this.
He argues that nothing in human history, and certainly nothing regarding the propagation of the Christian church, is left to geographical luck or random circumstance.
No. To illustrate how God's sovereign purpose interacts with human history, Owen employs two brilliant metaphors that would have deeply resonated with his 17th century audience.
Let's talk about the first one, the metaphor of the wax in the seal.
Yeah, explain how he uses that.
Well, he says that all the events of history, all the movements of nations, armies, and even apostles are merely the wax.
Wax, okay.
And the eternal counsel and purpose of God is the seal.
Right. So when a king presses his signet ring into hot wax, the wax doesn't decide what shape it takes.
Exactly. It has no agency to form a different crest. It merely yields and conforms perfectly to the immutable design carved into the seal.
So human events are the soft wax, receiving the exact impression of God's eternal decrees.
That is such a powerful image of total conformity to a predetermined design.
It really is. But he uses the second metaphor that I find even more fascinating, because it taps into the cutting-edge technology of his era.
He compares God's providence to a clock.
Yes, the clockwork universe. In the 1640s, mechanical clocks were the most complex, sophisticated pieces of machinery in existence.
They represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering.
Right. So Owen says, imagine opening up the back of a grand, complex timepiece. You see a multitude of lower, inferior wheels and gears.
Some are spinning incredibly fast.
Some are moving agonizingly slow. Some are turning clockwise, while others are turning counterclockwise.
Seemingly in direct opposition to one another.
Exactly. To an untrained eye, it looks like eccentric chaos.
It looks like they're fighting each other.
But Owen notes every single one of those eccentric, opposing wheels is connected to and driven by one master spring. Yes. The master spring dictates the regular, purposeful motion of the entire apparatus to achieve one specific end, telling the correct time.
God's eternal counsel is the master spring of history.
We might look at the gears of human events, a civil war here, a blocked apostle there, a king fleeing in disguise, and see nothing but chaotic opposing forces.
But Owen assures the Parliament that the master spring is turning every single gear with absolute precision. Okay, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because this is the exact point where modern listeners, and frankly many people in Owen's day, start to experience severe theological vertigo.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow.
If we accept this premise of sovereign control, if God is the master spring guaranteeing the outcome of every single movement in the clock, doesn't the distinction between divine control and human agency become completely meaningless?
I see where you're going with this.
I mean, think about the men sitting in the pews listening to this sermon. These MPs had just fought a war based on the belief that King Charles had made wicked, tyrannical choices.
They were actively executing royalist dissenters for treason, holding them morally and legally responsible for their actions.
Right. If they truly believed that God's master spring ordered the gears of that treason, how do they justify the execution? Doesn't this level of meticulous providence turn humans into mere robots? And worse, doesn't it make God the author of the very sin he punishes?
That is the most critical objection to Reformed theology, and Owen does not shy away from it.
He hits it head on.
He anticipates this exact pushback, and he answers it by diving into the classical Reformed distinction between primary and secondary causality.
Right.
This is the philosophical framework that allows Owen to maintain God's absolute sovereignty without destroying human responsibility.
Walk us through that framework. How does a primary cause interact with a secondary cause without violating it?
Okay, so Owen argues that God is the first cause of all things. He sustains the universe and provides the overarching motion for all events.
The master spring.
Right. However, God executes his will through second causes, which are the creatures, the elements, and the natural laws of the world.
Okay.
The crucial point Owen makes is that when the first cause acts upon a second cause, it does not violate the inherent nature of that second cause.
So it doesn't force it to be something it's not.
Exactly. Rather, it guarantees that the second cause will act according to its nature.
That sounds highly theoretical. Give me an example of how that works in the natural world.
Owen uses the element of fire. God created fire, and by his sovereign providence, he sustains the existence of fire.
But God's sovereign preservation does not force the fire to do something unnatural.
No, the fire burns necessarily, agreeable to its own natural properties. It acts exactly as it was designed to act.
Okay, I follow.
In the same way, God governs human beings.
Yeah.
But because humans are rational creatures endowed with a will, God's sovereign governance ensures that humans act freely according to their own desires and natures.
So God guarantees the ultimate outcome, but the mechanism he uses to achieve that outcome is our own uncoerced actual desires.
Precisely. The traitor commits treason because he genuinely, freely desires power or wealth.
He is acting according to the sinful desires of his own heart.
He is completely culpable. Yet God sovereignly orchestrates the boundaries and the timing of those free actions to fulfill his overarching master plan.
Owen points to the crucifixion of Jesus as the ultimate biblical proof of this, doesn't he?
He does. In Acts 4, the apostles pray and state that Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Roman soldiers, and the crowds in Jerusalem did exactly what God's hand and counsel had predestined to take place.
Which is a staggering statement. The worst crime in human history was perfectly predestined.
Yes, but, and this is vital, God did not force Pilate to be a coward.
God did not inject malice into the hearts of the Pharisees.
Right, they acted freely, out of their own wickedness, and are entirely responsible for their sin. Yeah. But their wicked free choices were the exact gears God used to turn the master spring of the atonement.
But the tension still remains for many.
Oh, absolutely.
If God is the first cause, providing the energy for the action, how can he remain completely untainted by the moral defect of the action?
Right, if God powers the clock and the gear is rusty, doesn't the clockmaker bear responsibility for the rust?
Exactly.
Well, to answer that, Owen uses a brilliant philosophical analogy that is famous in Reformed scholasticism.
I love this one.
He says, imagine a man who possesses a miraculous power to cause a lame person to walk.
Okay.
He approaches a man with a severe defect in his leg, and by his power, he provides the energy and the motion for the man to walk across the room.
The man walks, but because of his defective leg, he walks with a severe, agonizing limp.
Right. So Owen asks, is the man who provided the power responsible for the walking?
Yes, obviously. Without his power, the lame man couldn't move at all.
Right. But is the man who provided the power responsible for the limp?
No. The motion comes from the benefactor, but the defect, the limp, belongs entirely to the biology of the lame man.
Exactly. God provides the providential motion for all human actions. In him we live and move and have our being.
But the moral defect, the sin, the limp, arises entirely from the corrupted nature of the fallen human being.
God is the cause of the action, but the creature is the sole cause of the sinfulness of the action.
Owen uses another illustration from nature too, right? The sun.
Yes, this one is great. When the sun shines its intense heat onto a beautiful garden of roses, it exhales a sweet, magnificent fragrance.
But when that exact same sun shines its intense heat onto a stagnant, rotting kennel of sewage, it exhales a putrid, noisome stench.
The sun is the cause of the smell being drawn out in both cases.
Yes, the sun's heat is the universal power.
But the sun is not the cause of the stench of the kennel.
The defect, the putridity, is inherent to the sewage itself. The sun merely activates what is already there.
In this way, Owen establishes that God is completely sovereign over the dispensation of the gospel, guiding every step of the Apostle Paul without being the author of the sin of the nations that are left in darkness.
Which brings us back to the stark reality of Acts 16. The master spring has turned.
The Holy Spirit has blocked Paul from Bithynia and sent him to Macedonia.
The first cause has directed the dispensation of grace. This forces us to ask the why question.
Right.
If God is perfectly capable of sending the gospel anywhere, what is his twofold purpose in this mystery of sending and withholding? Let's start with the harder side of that coin.
Okay.
Why does God actively withhold the gospel from certain regions or certain people?
Owen leans heavily on the Apostle Paul's theology in Romans 9 to answer it.
He states that God withholds the gospel from certain people to advance the glory of his own justice.
He leaves them in their sins, allowing them to remain what Paul calls vessels of wrath fitted to destruction.
That is an incredibly heavy doctrine, especially for modern ears. The idea that God intentionally leaves people in spiritual darkness so that his justice can be displayed in their condemnation.
It is a sobering, terrifying doctrine. But Owen immediately clarifies it using the same logic of causality we just discussed. He says that God's decision not to send the truth certainly means that those without it will perish, because the gospel is the only means of salvation. However, God is no more the cause of the sins for which they are damned than the sun is the cause of cold and darkness.
Right, because cold is not a substance that the sun creates. Cold is simply the natural state of the universe when the sun's heat is absent.
Darkness is just the absence of light.
So when God withdraws the light of the gospel, the natural inherent darkness of the human heart simply remains what it is.
Exactly. Or, to put it in legal terms, Owen says God is like a wealthy man who sees a criminal in prison for a massive debt.
The wealthy man has the funds to pay the debt, but he chooses to walk past the cell and leave the criminal there.
Right. And the wealthy man's refusal to pay the debt is not the reason the criminal is in prison.
The criminal's own theft, his own law-breaking, is the reason he is in prison. The wealthy man didn't make him a criminal.
Precisely. The criminal is simply suffering the just consequences of his own actions.
God withholding the gospel is a sovereign act that regulates his eternal purpose to manifest his justice. He permits humanity to follow their own sinful desires, and he justly punishes them for the sins they willingly and freely commit.
I think an expanded analogy helps synthesize this, because people often confuse justice with fairness.
Very true. Let's hear it.
Imagine a governor dealing with a maximum security prison. Inside this prison are 1,000 inmates.
Okay.
Every single one of them has been given a fair trial. Every single one of them has been proven guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt of heinous crimes, and every single one of them has been legally sentenced to life without parole.
They all absolutely deserve to be there.
Now, suppose the governor, out of the sheer goodness of his heart, decides to issue a full, unmerited pardon to 100 of those inmates. He opens their cells and lets them walk free.
That is an act of astonishing, breathtaking mercy.
It is grace in its purest form.
But what about the 900 inmates left in their cells? If they grab the bars and scream, "That's not fair, you are unjust," what is the proper response?
The governor hasn't been unjust to them at all. He didn't force them to commit their crimes.
They are simply serving out the exact legal sentence they earned. The ones who receive the pardon get mercy. The ones who stay in the cell get justice.
But nobody in the entire prison gets injustice.
That is a perfect articulation of the Reformed view of election and reprobation, and it is exactly the framework Owen is operating from.
No human being is innocent. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, if God leaves a nation without the gospel, He is merely leaving them to the justice they have earned.
So that explains the withholding, but it naturally leads to the second part of God's purpose. Why does he send the gospel? If no one deserves it, why pardon the 100 inmates?
Why root Paul to Macedonia?
Exactly.
Well, Owen says there are two reasons for the sending. The primary reason is that God has a peculiar, eternal aim toward his elect.
He sends the gospel as a search and rescue mission to effectually call out and save the specific people. He has purposed to redeem from before the foundation of the world for the praise of his glorious grace.
Owen uses another passage from Acts to prove this, right? The situation in Corinth.
Yes, Acts 18. Paul is in Corinth, a notoriously wicked city, and he is facing intense opposition.
But God speaks to Paul in a vision and says, "Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace, for I have much people in this city."
Now, from a human perspective, God didn't have any people in Corinth. They were pagans. They were idolaters.
They were living in gross immorality. They were currently in the possession of the devil.
But from the perspective of the eternal master spring, they were already his.
Exactly. In God's eternal counsel, they were his elect. And the gospel was the specific instrument sent to that specific city to wake them up, break their chains, and bring them home.
But Owen also notes a secondary, more sobering reason why the gospel is sometimes sent.
Sometimes it is sent to a place where God knows the majority will reject it,
Why would God send the cure to people he knows will refuse to drink it?
to leave them entirely without excuse. The gospel can be sent to an unthankful people who bring forth no fruit, specifically to manifest God's glorious blinding justice when they despise the light.
It demonstrates the sheer hardness of the human heart, that even when the pardon is offered, they prefer their prison cell.
This theology of meticulous sovereign providence wasn't just an intellectual exercise for Owen.
No, he didn't preach this to win a seminary debate.
He applied it directly and immediately to the trauma the parliamentarians had just survived.
Think about the psychological state of the men in that room. They had spent 4 years ordering the deaths of their countrymen.
They had seen their estates plundered, their families divided, and their nation bathed in blood.
If history is just a random concurrence of atoms, then all that suffering was meaningless chaos.
But Owen looks at them and says, no, the master spring was turning every single gear of this war.
He is offering them a profound, almost jarring pastoral comfort. He acknowledges the violence, the tempests, and the storms they've endured.
But he challenges them to reevaluate that trauma through the lens of divine providence.
He asks them to look back at the darkest moments of the war and ask themselves, didn't those terrifying storms strip away your self-reliance?
Didn't they force you to your knees? Didn't they drive you to seek shelter in the sovereignty of God when every earthly support had collapsed?
He tells them to look for the spiritual fruit that grew in the soil of their suffering.
And he uses a phrase that is incredibly poignant. He suggests that if they truly understand what God was doing in the unseen spiritual realm while the physical war was raging, they will eventually look back at the trauma and say, "Happy tempest, which cast me into such a harbor."
Happy tempest. It feels like an oxymoron, but it captures the essence of Reformed thinking.
It really does.
And I think for anyone listening to this deep dive right now, this is a moment where the 17th century crashes directly into the present.
We all experience storms.
We experience sudden job losses, terrifying medical diagnoses, the collapse of relationships, periods of profound anxiety that feel like total senseless chaos.
And the natural human reaction is to ask, why is this random tragedy happening to me?
But Owen is aggressively challenging you to reframe your reality. He is suggesting that the storm that is wrecking your carefully laid plans, the tempest that feels like it is tearing your life apart, might be the very wind sovereignly ordained to blow you away from your own destructive self-sufficiency and drive you into the only safe harbor of Christ's grace.
If a tragedy forces you to realize that your soul needs rescuing, Owen would argue it is the most severe mercy you could ever receive.
It is a radical reframing of suffering. But as Owen moves into the next section of his sermon, he takes this doctrine of sovereign grace and uses it to strike a devastating blow against human pride.
Because if we accept the premise we just established, that God acts like a governor issuing pardons to guilty inmates, the natural reflexive inclination of the human ego is to look for a reason why certain people get the pardon.
Right. We inherently want the universe to operate as a meritocracy.
If God sent the gospel to the English Parliament in 1646, or if God sends the gospel to you and your family today, we want to believe that it's because we earned our spot at the front of the line.
We want to believe that the English were just a bit more civilized, or a bit more moral, or possessed a bit more civic virtue than the people who were left in darkness.
And this is where Owen drops his second major observation, which utterly annihilates that kind of thinking.
He declares that the sending of the gospel is an act of mere, completely unmerited free grace. No nation, no city, and no individual possesses a single ounce of merit that attracts the gospel.
He unpacks this by diving deep into the theology of demerit. And he makes a very careful distinction between negative demerit and positive demerit.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he starts with the baseline of human existence since the fall. In Reformed theology, this goes back to the covenant of works.
Originally, Adam was given a law in the garden. Obey and live, disobey and die.
Adam disobeyed, and humanity fell with him. Therefore, every single human being inherits a corrupt nature and has actively sinned against the law of God.
This means everyone possesses a negative demerit.
Meaning, we have forfeited any right to demand good things from God.
Exactly. None of us deserve to have any good done to us. Our negative demerit means that if God decided to act strictly according to what we deserve, he would have to keep the gospel locked away in his own bosom forever, and the entire human race would perish justly.
Okay, so that establishes that nobody is intrinsically good.
But what about positive demerit? Is it possible that even as fallen, sinful people, we can do something, maybe exhibit a certain level of civic morality or philosophical inquiry that positively attracts God's attention and obligates him to reward us with the gospel?
Is there a conditional promise where God says, if you act good enough in your natural fallen state, I will pay you back with the light of salvation?
Owen says absolutely, unequivocally not. There is no positive demerit. There is no conditional promise.
He argues that trying to attract the grace of God with our natural morality is like trying to bribe a king with a handful of dirt. It possesses no purchasing power whatsoever.
And to prove this, he doesn't just rely on logic. He turns to the historical record of Scripture to see who actually receives the gospel first.
And this is where he brings up the city of Corinth, which serves as the ultimate historical wrecking ball against the idea of human merit.
Corinth is the perfect case study. If God distributed the gospel based on civic virtue or philosophical readiness, where would Paul have gone?
He would have stayed in Athens, the center of philosophy and intellectual discourse, or he would have gone to a city known for its strict moral codes.
Instead, the greatest church planting success of Paul's early ministry happens in Corinth.
We need to explain what Corinth was, because it wasn't just a generic ancient city.
Corinth was an isthmus, a massive trade hub where the East met the West.
It was characterized by staggering, newly acquired wealth, intense upward social mobility, and total moral deregulation.
It was dominated by the Temple of Aphrodite. It was a place where merchants, sailors, and freedmen came to get rich and indulge in every conceivable vice.
The Apostle Paul himself lists the defining characteristics of the Corinthian population in his first letter to them.
In 1 Corinthians 6, he writes to the church and reminds them of what they used to be. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, men who practice homosexuality, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, swindlers.
Owen looks at this list and asks the Parliament, if you look at these people with the eyes of flesh, do these seem like goodly qualifications to receive the gospel?
It's the exact opposite of a qualification. You would think these people would be at the very bottom of God's list. You would think the gospel would bypass Corinth completely because they were too far gone.
As Owen vividly puts it, divine justice could not require fitter fuel for hell than the Corinthians. They were the epitome of moral corruption.
And yet the gospel comes to them first. The brightest light of salvation shines on the people sitting in the deepest, most profound darkness.
Meanwhile, Christ himself points out in the Gospels that cities like Tyre and Sidon, who might have repented in sackcloth and ashes, were passed over, while the gospel was preached to Chorazin and Bethsaida, who stubbornly rejected it.
It completely upends our human sense of fairness. God is essentially saying, I do not bargain with you.
It's like a man walking into a high-end jewelry store, asking to buy a priceless billion-dollar diamond and offering to pay for it with a piece of pocket lint and a half-eaten breath mint.
The currency of our civic morality is completely worthless when it comes to purchasing divine grace.
Owen is pounding this point into the minds of the English Parliament. You cannot bargain with God.
If you have the gospel, if you live in a land where the truth is preached, it is not because you are superior to the native populations of other continents. It is 100% unmerited charity.
And Owen anchors this universal, unrestricted offer of charity in the ultimate theological bedrock, the blood of Jesus Christ.
Why is it fitting for the gospel to be preached to anyone, anywhere, regardless of how wicked or degraded they are?
Why can the offer of salvation be extended to the most vile sinner in Corinth or London or anywhere else?
Owen says it is founded entirely on the infinite value and worth of the ransom paid by Christ.
Because Christ is the infinite Son of God, his sacrifice has infinite merit.
Precisely. The blood of Christ is a ransom of infinite worth. Therefore, it possesses a limitless fitness to be proclaimed to the entire world.
This doctrine completely demolishes the idea of Christian nationalism in its toxic forms. It tears down the idea that any single nation is inherently a holy land, or that any ethnic group is intrinsically better or more deserving of God's favor.
The blood of Christ is sufficient to save the worst of sinners, so the offer goes out to all indiscriminately as an act of pure, sovereign grace.
But there is a terrifying flip side to this doctrine.
If the presence of the gospel in a nation is pure charity, completely unmerited and unearned, then God is under no obligation to keep it there.
If a nation abuses that charity, if they take the gospel for granted or distort it for their own power, God can absolutely remove it.
And this is where the tone of the deep dive shifts dramatically. Owen takes this high, soaring theology of sovereign grace and turns it into a laser beam, aiming it directly at the politicians sitting in front of him.
He issues a historical warning to the House of Commons that would have made the room incredibly tense.
He reminds these men, who are currently flush with victory, boasting about their role as the defenders of the Protestant Reformation, that England has actually forfeited the gospel twice before in its history.
Spiritual amnesia is a recurring theme in human history. We forget so quickly that we are tenants, not owners, of the truth.
Walk us through the two historical forfeitures Owen brings up to shatter their complacency.
First, he points back to the early days of Christianity in the British Isles. The gospel was actually professed in Britain very early on during the time of the Roman Empire.
There was a thriving Celtic and British church.
But, Owen says, the ancient Britons grew comfortable. The gospel was soon abused, and the society devolved into wickedness, oppression, and nominalism.
As a result of their spiritual rot, God removed his protection and allowed the pagan Anglo-Saxons to sweep across the sea.
God used the pagan invasions as an instrument of divine judgment, much like he used Babylon to judge Israel in the Old Testament.
Exactly. The Saxons literally fattened the land with the blood of the Christian inhabitants. They subverted the true worship of God entirely, replacing it with paganism.
The light of the gospel in England was effectively extinguished by the sword.
Hmm.
That was the first forfeiture.
What was the second?
Eventually, missionaries like Augustine of Canterbury arrived, and the Saxons themselves were converted. The gospel returned to the island.
But over the centuries, the light faded again.
This time, it wasn't conquered violently by a foreign sword. It was suffocated slowly from within. Owen describes it as being, by insensible degrees, like summer fading imperceptibly into winter.
It's the danger of the slow fade. You don't realize you're freezing until you're already numb.
And what they faded into, according to Owen's staunch Puritan perspective, was the anti-Christian superstition of the papacy.
England fell into profound theological darkness, gradually exchanging the true, grace-based gospel of Christ for the complex, works-based superstitions, rituals, and corruptions of medieval Rome.
So twice, God mercifully granted England the light of the gospel, and twice they lost it because they failed to value it.
And Owen brings up this history lesson because he is fiercely critiquing a faction from his own present day, the very people the Parliament had just been fighting in the Civil War.
Yes, he is aiming his sights directly at the hierarchists, the High Church Arminian faction within the Church of England, which had been led by figures like the recently executed Archbishop William Laud.
Now, to understand the intensity of the Civil War, we have to understand what this faction represented to men like John Owen.
We are analyzing Owen's perspective here, and to him, the theology of Archbishop Laud was not just a polite difference of opinion about how to conduct a church service. He viewed it as a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse. That implies it looked like a gift, or at least looked harmless on the outside. But it was secretly hiding an invading army designed to destroy the city from within, what was inside the horse.
Inside the horse was what Owen considered a collection of popish errors. Archbishop Laud had tried to enforce a rigid, highly ceremonial liturgy on the English and Scottish churches.
He brought back crucifixes, elaborate altars, the requirement to bow at the name of Jesus, and crucially, he promoted Arminian theology,
which emphasized human free will and cooperation in salvation, pushing back against the Reformed doctrines of predestination and absolute grace.
To Owen, this wasn't just an aesthetic preference for stained glass and incense. By reintroducing human merit and ritualism into salvation, the High Church faction was deliberately, underhandedly combining with the enemy to drag England right back into the theological darkness of Rome.
And what made this so terrifying to the Puritans wasn't just that these ideas existed. It was that these theological errors were being married to the coercive power of the state.
Archbishop Laud used the Star Chamber, a royal court, to brutally punish, mutilate, and imprison Puritans who disagreed with his theology.
That is the crux of Owen's warning. He tells Parliament, the sword of error never cuts dangerously, but when it is managed with such a hand.
If a man has a flawed theological idea in his own living room, it might harm his own soul, but it doesn't threaten the nation.
But when theological error is mixed with civil and ecclesiastical power, it becomes the most destructive force on earth. It violently urges obedience to falsehood. It tortures the conscience.
Owen was telling the parliamentarians, God just delivered you through 4 years of blood and fire from a system that was trying to force you back into spiritual bondage. Do not take this deliverance lightly. Do not allow the Trojan horse back inside the gates.
But there's a fascinating pushback here, not from me, but from the people in Owen's own day.
Because some people in 1646 were looking at the current state of the Reformation, the parliamentarian side, with all its new freedom from the king's bishops, and they were complaining.
They were experiencing the anxiety of freedom. With the rigid control of the bishops gone, new sects were popping up. There were theological debates everywhere. There was division.
The religious landscape looked messy, and some people were saying, this new way is too chaotic. Look at all these radical sects. Maybe we were better off before under the king's strict order.
It is the classic reactionary fear of liberty. When you remove a tyrant, the resulting freedom always looks a bit chaotic at first.
Owen addresses these pessimists directly. He says they are looking at the nation through false glasses, seeing nothing but errors and confusion because they are entirely focused on the imperfections of the present moment.
And he gives them a brilliant agricultural analogy to expose their flawed thinking.
He says it is like a man walking into a massive, thriving field of wheat. The harvest is growing beautifully, but the man looks down and sees a few red weeds, a little bit of cockle growing among the corn.
And instead of pulling the weeds, he instantly panics, throws his hands in the air and yells, "There is no corn here. It is all weeds. Tear down the fences and let the wild boars of the forest eat it all."
I mean, how relevant is that analogy to the way we consume information today?
We have an innate tendency to spot 3 problems, 3 anomalies, or 3 loud extremists in a massive movement of good, and we immediately declare the entire enterprise a catastrophic failure.
We want to burn down the whole field because we are obsessed with a few weeds.
It is a profound warning against cynicism and reactionary panic. Owen is telling Parliament, yes, there are radical sects. Yes, there is theological confusion right now, but do not lose sight of the massive harvest of truth that is growing.
The harvest will one day vindicate the truth. God is at work, even if the field looks messy right now. Do not tear down the fences of the Reformation just because you are frightened by a few weeds.
But Owen isn't just giving them an agricultural analogy or a history lesson to win a debate about church governance. He is meticulously leading up to the climax of the sermon.
He has established that God is sovereign, that the gospel is unmerited grace, and that England is in danger of losing it.
Now, he delivers his third and final major observation, which is the most urgent, emotional plea of the entire deep dive.
He needs the politicians to understand exactly what is at stake if they fail. He says, no one in the entire world needs help like those who lack the gospel.
He defines living without the gospel as the ultimate deprivation.
And the contrast he sets up here is incredibly stark because he is speaking to men who have just survived a war.
They know what physical deprivation looks like. They have seen men starving, freezing, and bleeding to death.
But Owen wants to completely separate physical suffering from spiritual death.
Yeah.
He walks them through a list of biblical figures who experienced severe physical, emotional, or political lacks, but were still fundamentally eternally blessed.
He points out that human beings can survive almost any earthly tragedy if their soul is secure.
Yes. He says a man may want liberty, he may be locked in a dungeon, and yet be profoundly happy, as Joseph was when he was rotting in an Egyptian prison.
A man may want peace. He may be hunted by his enemies and yet be entirely secure, as David was when he was hiding in the caves from King Saul.
A man may want wealth and comfort and still be overflowing with joy, like the prophet Micaiah when he was thrown into prison and fed the bread of affliction.
You can lack liberty, peace, wealth, health, and status,
Yeah.
and still be profoundly okay. But if a person is without the gospel, They are missing Jesus Christ, who is the only source of true life.
Owen's language in this section is absolutely devastating. He doesn't mince words. He says, "A throne without the gospel is but the devil's dungeon. Wealth without the gospel is but fuel for hell. Advancement without the gospel is but a going high to have the greater fall."
To lack the gospel is to lack the bread of life, the living water, the only acceptable ransom for your captive soul. You can conquer the entire world, you can sit on the throne of England, but if you do not have Christ, you are a beggar starving in a dungeon.
And to make the weight of this spiritual starvation palpable to his audience, he brings in two visceral, heartbreaking examples of human desperation from the Old Testament.
First, he talks about Rachel. Rachel was barren, and she was watching her sister bear children while her own womb remained empty.
The psychological pain was so intense that she cried out to her husband Jacob in Genesis 30, "Give me children or else I die."
It is a cry of absolute existential distress.
It is. But as Owen points out, it was an earthly distress. Her assessment of her situation was flawed. If she had lived the rest of her life without children, she would have grieved, but she still would have lived. Her eternal soul was not in jeopardy.
Then, Owen turns to an even more harrowing example, Hagar in the wilderness.
This is one of the most painful scenes in the book of Genesis. Hagar has been exiled into the desert with her young son, Ishmael. Their water skin runs dry.
The boy is collapsing from dehydration. Hagar places him under a shrub, and she walks a bowshot away, far enough so she can't hear him whimpering, and she sits down in the sand and weeps, because she cannot bear to watch her own child die of thirst.
It is the absolute pinnacle of human agony.
But Owen takes that imagery of a mother watching her child die, and he elevates the stakes to eternity. He says, if Ishmael had died of thirst under that shrub, it would have been a tragedy. But it would have merely been an early paying of the debt of mortality that every single human being owes.
Ishmael was going to die eventually anyway.
But Owen thunders, they that want the gospel do not just die temporally, like Ishmael for want of water. They die eternally in the flames of fire. To lack the gospel is to cry out, with infinitely more justification than Rachel, give us the gospel, or we die eternally.
The horror of physical death is merely a shadow of the horror of the second death. But here's the real tragedy, the most chilling insight of the whole sermon for me.
Owen points out that the millions of people in England who are in this state of acute spiritual starvation, well, they don't even know it.
That is the seal upon their misery. He says that gospelless men know not that they are blind, so they do not seek eye salve. They know not that they are dead, so they do not seek life.
They are entirely oblivious to their own eternal peril.
It is the tragedy of spiritual ignorance. It is like an aristocratic patient who rushes into the hospital, demanding that the chief of surgery drop everything to fix a slight cosmetic tremor in his hand, blissfully, arrogantly unaware that his major arteries are systematically shutting down and he is minutes away from a massive cardiac event.
The people Owen is describing spend all their time, all their anxiety, and all their resources seeking to supply their natural wants. They want better food, nicer houses, higher wages, more political power, or they want to satisfy their sinful lusts.
They're deafeningly loud about their physical discomforts, but regarding their spiritual wants, there is a deep, terrifying graveyard silence.
They go to hell, as the psalmist says, like sheep, quietly, without dread, following the herd.
Or, as Owen quotes from the book of Proverbs, they are like a bird hasting to a snare, not knowing that it is for its life.
The bird sees the bait, it sees the comfortable seat on the ground, and it flies straight into the trap, completely unaware of the net until it snaps shut.
And this brings Owen to his fiery, urgent conclusion. With this terrifying reality established, that millions of people in their own nation are blindly walking into an eternal snare while Parliament congratulates itself on a military victory, how does he demand these politicians respond?
He tells them that mercies that are not improved upon become bitter judgment.
That is a classic Puritan maxim. If God gives you a massive blessing like political power, peace, or the pure preaching of the gospel, and you do not use it to glorify him and help others, that blessing will actually become the instrument of your own condemnation.
He says the gospel is the salt that makes everything else in life savory. Without the gospel, all of England's immense wealth, all their recent spectacular military victories, all their newly consolidated political power, it is all just putting them in a full pasture to be fatted for the day of slaughter.
The cow thinks the lush grass is a blessing, unaware that the farmer is just preparing it for the butcher. If Parliament doesn't use its victory to spread the gospel, their victory is just fattening them for judgment.
And he doesn't just issue a vague call to do better. He directly, specifically challenges both the ministers of the church and the magistrates in Parliament.
He looks at his fellow clergy and calls them out for their shocking lack of zeal. He notes the dark irony that false teachers, heretics, and purveyors of popish error will compass sea and land to make proselytes.
They will swim across freezing rivers, they will risk imprisonment, they will travel to the ends of the earth to spread their superstitions.
But the preachers of the everlasting gospel, the men who actually possess the truth, they seem to have lost their fire. They want to stay comfortable in their well-funded London parishes. They don't want to get their boots muddy.
And then, after indicting his own profession, he turns his sights directly on Parliament, the men sitting in the pews, holding the purse strings and the legislative power.
He begs them to look away from London and look at the dark, neglected, rural places of their own realm. He specifically names Wales, the north of England, and the west.
He says the people in those regions are crying out, "Come and help us," exactly like the man of Macedonia.
Now, there is a deep historical context here. Why were Wales and the north so neglected?
Throughout the Civil War, those regions were the strongest bastions of royalist support. They had fought bitterly against Parliament. And part of the reason they supported the king and his high church bishops was because they had been kept in profound theological ignorance by a corrupt, absentee clergy.
Parliament's instinct was to view the North and Wales as hostile territories that needed to be subdued by military occupation and punitive taxes.
Parliament wants to send the army to keep them down.
Yes, but Owen tells them, no, you don't need to send the new model army to subjugate them. You need to send preachers to save them.
He uses the analogy of the manna in the wilderness from the book of Exodus. When God rained down manna from heaven, the rule was that everyone was supposed to have an equal share. He who gathered much had nothing over, and he who gathered little had no lack.
But Owen looks at the spiritual landscape of England and says, right now, the distribution of the manna is a travesty. Some sheep are in incredibly lush pastures, picking the choicest flowers every day, meaning places like London and the university towns, which had an abundance of brilliant, solid Puritan preaching.
While other sheep, the souls in Wales and the north, are wandering on barren mountains, starving to death without a guide or a crumb of spiritual food.
He is demanding structural national action. He isn't asking for a polite charity drive. He is telling the government, use your legislative success, use the vast resources you just confiscated from the royalists, and fund the deployment of preachers into the darkest corners of this nation.
Send the gospel to your former enemies. If you don't do that, if you just sit on your victory and count your money, your political triumph means absolutely nothing.
And that brings us to the ultimate enduring takeaway of this sermon. Owen warns that all earthly prosperity, all political power, all intellectual achievement, if it is devoid of Jesus Christ, is just a cipher without a figure.
Let's explain that phrase, because it relies on the mathematical terminology of the 17th century. What is a cipher without a figure?
A cipher, in the old terminology of arithmetic, is a zero. If you walk up to a chalkboard and you write a zero, it has no value. If you write 100 zeros in a long row, 0, 0, 0, 0, they still add up to nothing. They represent a void.
But if you take a figure, a real number, like a 1, and you place it at the front of that line of zeros 1 million, suddenly all those zeros have immense compounding value.
Owen is saying that your health, your bank account, your military victories, your career advancement, your quiet life in the suburbs, they are all just zeros. They are ciphers. On their own, they are mathematically worthless in the economy of eternity. Without Christ as the leading figure, they add up to absolutely nothing.
So we have to ask, what does this 17th century Puritan sermon mean for you, the listener, today? Because we don't live in 1646. We aren't recovering from the English Civil War.
But the human heart hasn't changed a single degree. Think about your own life right now. How are you assessing your success? Are you evaluating your happiness by your possessions, by the title on your business card, by how much peace and quiet you have in your home?
If you have all of that, if your life is a long, incredibly comfortable string of zeros, but you are neglecting the gospel, Owen says you are just the bird hastening to the snare.
You are flying toward the trap, mesmerized by the bait of your own comfort. What if your current, affluent, highly managed life is actually the most dangerous place you could possibly be because it is insulating you from the reality that you are spiritually starving?
That is the haunting, inescapable question of John Owen. It strips away all our modern coping mechanisms and forces us to ask if we are valuing the one true necessity, the unum necessarium, above all the failing temporary wiles of earthly support.
And it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. We live in an era defined by the quantified self. We have smartwatches that track our REM sleep, our resting heart rate, our daily steps, and our macronutrients.
We have financial apps that track every cent of our net worth in real time. We have infinitely complex metrics to measure the zeros in our lives, ensuring that we are physically optimized and financially secure.
But if Owen is right, if the most catastrophic deficit a human being can suffer, spiritual starvation, is fundamentally invisible to the person experiencing it, how do we measure a deficit that our most advanced metrics are entirely blind to? In our desperate modern quest to optimize the body and the bank account, are we perfectly engineering our own eternal ruins simply because we forgot to measure the soul?
It is a terrifying paradox. We have never had more data, and we have never been more blind to the only metric that survives the grave.
We started this deep dive by talking about how we naturally expect history to be a clean, rational chessboard of human strategy. We want to believe that the generals, the politicians, and our own smart choices dictate the outcome of our lives.
But what John Owen showed the English Parliament, and what he shows us today, is that behind the chaos of civil wars, behind the rise and fall of nations, and behind the seemingly random storms of our own lives, there is a master spring of divine providence turning the wheels.
And that providence is entirely focused on one magnificent thing, the unmerited, unfathomable free grace of God seeking out unworthy sinners. It shatters our pride, it offends our sense of fairness, but it is the only thing in the universe that offers true, enduring hope.
It is the absolute essence of reformed thinking. It strips us of our self-righteousness, it humbles the powerful, and it always, always drives us away from our own merit and back to the sovereign, majestic grace of God.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to 1646. We hope this deep dive challenges you, comforts you in your own tempests, and perhaps flips your chessboard upside down just a little bit. Until next time, keep your eyes on the master spring and don't forget the figure that gives value to all your zeros. Take care.